This video is brought to you with support of TrueFire. Practice smart and play hard with TrueFire. Hi, this is Keith Williams. Welcome to 5-Watt World, where we're interested to help you get the most music from the least gear. Fender versus Vox versus Marshall. What is it that makes each of these iconic amps sound the way they do? What was the history that led to them to have their unique voice? And what about the specific design that then led them to be used by the greats and fix them in our musical memories? We're going to briefly cover the history, circuit design, cabinet, and speakers, and give you playing examples to illustrate the differences. If you want to know the answer to those questions, then stay tuned, because this is the 5-Watt World short history of Fender versus Vox versus Marshall amps. If you like this style of video, be sure to subscribe. And to support what we do, grab a t-shirt, hoodie, or a 5-Watt World Barber Collaboration overdrive pedal. To become an even bigger part of 5-Watt World, sign up for the Friends of 5-Watt on Patreon. There's a friend level to suit any budget. All the links are in the description. These are going to be in roughly chronological order, so let's start with Fender. Fender Musical Instruments grew out of a radio repair business founded in 1938. By the 40s, Leo Fender had partnered with Clayton Doc Kaufman, forming K&F Manufacturing, to design and build lap steel guitars and amplifiers. They began production in 1945. In 46, Leo stopped doing repairs and went into manufacturing full-time, naming the new company Fender Electric Instruments. 48 to 59 roughly encompasses the Tweed amp era. These amps have a more mid-forward tone, and given their simpler circuitry, they are more likely to distort early in the volume curve. The first brown panel, or brown and blonde amps, based on the color of their Tolex, came along in '60 and ran until '63. This was a transitional time for Fender amps. In his continuing search for louder, clean tones, Leo began introducing more negative feedback into the designs. The smaller Tweed amps are sometimes referred to as mini Marshalls, as this denotes the continuation of the mid-range forward Tweed tone, but with more controllable low end than the Tweed amps had. These years have their own unique magic. See my video on the brown amps. But we're most interested in where these designs led, to the black panel amps. Black panel amps, so named for their faceplates, have been the most used and recorded amplifiers ever produced. Launched in '63, black panel Fenders had less mid-range than both the Tweed and brown amps that came before them. Because of this, they felt more refined in the way the level came on as you turned them up. They sound wonderful, and are on so many recordings they are likely the sound when we think of electric guitar. They became our reference against which all other amps are judged. But in addition to being the final refinement of Fender amp design, they became so wildly popular because they landed at exactly the right time in history. The Beatles would be on the Ed Sullivan Show for the first time in February of '64, sending every kid scrambling for an electric guitar and amp. Surf music further fueled this explosion in the early '60s. Fender was the dominant U.S. company building amplifiers at the time, and while other companies scrambled to catch up to meet the demand, Fender was ready to go and sold thousands of black panel amps of all sizes. Running from 1963 to 1968, the black control panel, black Tolex, and silver grill cloth defined the look of the ultimate Fender amps. Here, additional negative feedback and new phase inverter designs minimized clipping and distortion. A more complete tone stack, and the inclusion of reverb and tremolo as more standard features set black panel amps apart from all that came earlier. They are known for their sparkling clean tones from the fixed bias Class AB push-pull power section and the American-style speakers in open-back cabinets. The Deluxe Reverb was first released in 1963, followed by the Princeton Reverb in '64. These are the two most recorded guitar amps in history and remain solid choices both as standalone amps and as pedal platforms. Interestingly, black panel amps from the Deluxe on up share a very similar preamplifier design, the differences being the power sections providing ever more clean headroom as you go up in wattage. As I looked at which specific amp to focus on from each company, my gut told me to use a Fender Deluxe Reverb as the most popular Fender amp of all time. But you could certainly make the case for choosing a larger amp to make it more similar to the Vox AC30 and Marshall Plexi I'm going to use later, as representing the other two classic food groups. So I might have chosen a Vibrolux or a Super Reverb to have one-on-one in comparison. But because of their shared preamp design, what I'm going to say about the Deluxe is generally true of the larger amps as well. To get to the edge of too technical, the location of the tone stack and the circuit in the different amps is important. In the Fender, the circuit order is gain stage, tone stack, and recovery or makeup gain stage. There were bass and treble control knobs and a fixed mid-range resistor on the Deluxe that created a lightly scooped tone. The mid-range dip of a Deluxe is between 300 and 500 Hz, depending on the setting of the treble and bass control knobs. All of the amps have a mid-range dip, but the frequency location has a lot to do with the overall perceived character of the amp. The choice to use a fixed mid-range resistor in the Deluxe and Princeton created a scoop tone with less mid-range that emphasized the warm lows and clear high end. The position of the tone stack in the Fender makes the tone knobs much more impactful than we'll see in the Marshall. The Fender tone stack is driven by the plate of the first preamp tube, which is a high impedance way of driving the circuit. This is another reason the Fender tone knobs feel like they have more impact as you turn them up and down. Fender then housed these combo amp circuits in open back cabinets built from finger-joined solid pine with speaker baffles and back panels made of plywood. The solid pine contributed to the warmth and overall resonance of vintage Fenders, so much so that Fender now uses solid pine cabs for their current hand-wired amps as well. By the early 60s, Fender was using ceramic speakers. Early Deluxe Reverbs had Oxford speakers, and later they moved to using a Jensen C12Q, both ceramic. Ceramic speakers are tighter, and they handle more power than the Alnico speakers in the Fender Tweed amps. Tighter bass, more defined low end, more mid-range, and punchier. They also dealt with the heat better and so handled prolonged higher volumes better. Fender black panel amps were used in all styles of music, but in particular, country, surf, pop, jazz, and early folk rock like The Band or The Byrds. The Beatles even moved to using Fender amps in the studio after they stopped touring. Though in general, probably thought of less likely to appeal to a harder rock player, Rick Nielsen famously recorded all of the cheap trick parts that you might have assumed was a Marshall on a Deluxe turned all the way up with the bass control turned all the way down. Everyone has used Fender amps over the years, but a short list of current users that illustrates the range of music should include Vince Gill, Brent Mason, Tom Bukovac, Julian Lage, John Mayer, Larry Carlton, Trey Anastasio, Mike Campbell, and Bill Frisell. When David Barber and I were wrestling with how best to demo the sound of these classic amps, we debated miking up amps in David's collection, but in the end we decided to lean on the Universal Audio modeling pedals for 4 reasons. And the more cynical among you might think this is a paid spot. It is not. See my video, Can You Trust 5-Watt World, for more on that subject. I'm sure some of you will disagree with our choice here, but hear me out on the reasons before warming up the comment section. Number 1. Most of us cannot afford to buy a vintage 65 Deluxe, a 65 Vox AC30, and a 65 Marshall Plexi, but these 3 pedals, while not inexpensive, are within reach if we're willing to set aside some money to get them. I'm not interested in making cork-sniffing videos, as much fun as that might be. I'm much more interested in finding the ways to share these classic tones with as many of us as possible. Second, the digital models here are based on the best versions of these classic amps available. Every 65 Fender, Vox, or Marshall will now sound a little different, but these models are based on the best of each type available, period. You know that James Santiago and his team spared no expense in finding just the right amp to model. Third, the classic speaker and cabinets were modeled and mic'd by some of the best engineers in the business, capturing the way these amps should sound, not how David and I might be able to mic them up, even with David's engineering background. You could spend a lifetime learning how to mic up amps to get these tones, or we could just use the experience of the team at UA. Fourth, after working on and hearing a lifetime of great Deluxes, AC30s, and Plexis, David knows what the best ones sound like, and dialing these pedals, he was confident he could get those tones. I've been using TrueFire for years, so they are the perfect partner for 5-Watt World. I'm interested in all kinds of music, and TrueFire always has something to scratch the itch I have for learning more about guitar. I've always subscribed to the All Access Pass because it lets me use everything in the TrueFire catalog. As a viewer of 5-Watt World, you get an exclusive 50% discount on the All Access Pass. I've learned so much from TrueFire that I'm confident that you can too. Sign up using the link in the video description to support 5-Watt World and get some great lessons at the same time. Practice smart and play hard with TrueFire. I'd like to thank TrueFire for their support in making this video. Okay, let's get back to the amps and what makes them unique. Next is Vox. There was a ban on importing musical instruments to the UK from the US from 1951 to 59. This was part of a ban on importing luxury goods in after World War II. With the growth of small group electric pop, R&B, and blues, there was an increasing demand for amplifiers, and so a separate industry building amps sprung up in the UK. Dick Denny began working for Jennings Musical Instrument Company, or simply JMI, in 1957. A guitarist himself, he was close to the demands coming from working musicians in England. JMI released their first guitar amp in January of 1958, the AC1/15. Later shortened to AC15, and it was the first amp to carry the Vox name and quickly became the amp of choice in London. Famously, guitarist Vic Flick used an AC15 to record the iconic guitar part on the original James Bond theme. The golden years of Vox stretched from 1958 to 1967 when Tom Jennings left the company. But very soon, bands like The Shadows, with guitarist Hank Marvin, quickly realized they needed more power to be heard over the crowds of screaming girls at their performances. So Denny took what he knew and doubled the size of the power section, creating the AC30/4 Twin. The name indicated 4 inputs and 2 12-inch Celestion speakers. They had 2 channels and 30 watts, so from 1960 on, the AC30 changed the world. Near the end of 1961, Denny added a third top boost channel circuit to give the amp even more screaming top, to help cut through to be heard over the crowd. It successfully added the additional sparkle that the bands of the time were looking for to cut through the din of the fans. Fully half of all the amps produced by JMI were AC30 Twins. Through various ownership over the years, the amp has never been out of production, taking us from the beginnings all the way to the recent hand-wired amps released in 2025 by current Vox owners Korg. By 1962, the Beatles would buy their first Vox amps, the AC15 Twin and a top boost-equipped AC30 Twin. They used the amps in the studio to record their first big hit, Love Me Do. Unlike the fixed bias Fender amps with their distortion taming negative feedback, the Vox amps used a cathode bias design. Additionally, the lack of negative feedback lets the amp sound a little bit more lively and raw. People often cite the sound of an EL84 power tube as the biggest factor in the sound of a Vox, but like in all cases, it really is a combination of factors that leads to the mythical chime of Vox amplifiers. Not to say that there isn't a certain something about EL84 power tubes, coupled with their unique Celestion Alnico speakers that help create that jangling guitar tones that would define British pop in the 1960s. Interestingly, Denny and Jennings settled on EL84 power tubes because many of the Jennings organs had used them. I've said it already, but the word most frequently used to describe the unique sound of the Vox is chime, indicating the unique tonal profile of the amps, very different from the black panel Fenders that would come out actually 3 years later. The Vox AC30 became the amp against which all other Vox amps have been measured. We'll ignore the fact that you really can't get the famous AC30 tones at non-stage volumes. The amps are allowed even for club use. Pair it with an attenuator for mortal volume levels and you'll be happier, until you want to move it. Because of their construction, AC30s are heavy for their wattage. At between 68 and 75 pounds, like a Fender Twin Reverb at 65 to 90 pounds, they live best on casters or sitting in the road case they were moved in. Down at the circuit level, the top boost channel on a Vox preamp has a gain stage with a small value coupling capacitor that tightens things up. Then the volume control with a bright cap like in a deluxe reverb that can't be switched out. Then a gain stage directly coupled to a cathode follower which feeds the tone stack, then right into the phase inverter. The tone stack values used add up to more highs and less upper mids. The mid-range dip in an AC30 top boost channel is the highest of the 3 amps we're looking at, from 800 to 1200 Hz, depending on the tone stack settings. The fact that the amp has a tube rectifier makes all this high end a little bit softer, less strident, and more likable. And we'd be remiss if we didn't mention the cut control, which allows you to tame the highs just as the signal is going into the power amp. The open back, stiff plywood cabinet is a big factor in the tone of a Vox as well. The tops were made from 3/4 inch finger-joined birch ply, and the sides and bottom were typically made from 1/2 inch birch ply. The sides then had a 1/4 inch strip added to the front so they would match the thickness of the top panel. The speaker baffles were also made with birch ply. It all added up to a cabinet that was much heavier and brighter than a Fender cab. Sadly, by '64, some batches of AC30s were built with chipboard baffles, particularly in the years Thomas Organ owned the company. Like the Fender, it's an open back cabinet, letting sound emanate from the front and the back of the cabinet, mixing together in the room. Along with the unique features of the circuit and cabinet, the development of the Celestion Blue Alnico speaker contributed to the classic Vox sound. They began being used in the AC15 and AC30 amps in January of 1961. It was the first speaker designed specifically for electric guitar amps. They needed to use a pair of the 15-watt speakers to handle the wattage put out by the AC30. As I mentioned earlier, AC30s are famously loud amps. Dick Denny said in an interview that he believed that, quote, "Once in a while you get an amplifier that has an output that matches perfectly with the speakers. When that happens, it will sound twice as loud as the wattage that this amplifier is putting out," end quote. Classic Vox tones can of course be heard all over Britpop from all eras. Early users include the Shadows, the Beatles, the Kinks, the Yardbirds, the Rolling Stones, the Who, and Rory Gallagher. All in due course used AC30s. Later, Brian May and Queen, Joe Strummer and The Clash, Kevin Shields and My Funny Valentine, REM's Peter Buck, Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, The Edge and U2, Radiohead, Oasis, Muse, country guys John Jorgensen from the Hellcasters and Brad Paisley. They all use or used AC30s to great effect. And finally, the biggest and baddest of them all, Marshall. As mentioned earlier, there was a ban on importing musical instruments from the US to Britain from '51 to '59. But the rise in popular music was driving the demand for guitar amplifiers hard in the UK. Even when the ban was lifted, the number of imported amps from Fender didn't begin to meet demand. So in 1962, drummer and instrument shop owner Jim Marshall decided to take things into his own hands and began building amplifiers as alternatives to the larger, rare, and expensive American-built Fenders. By that point, the demand for ever louder amps that had been felt at Vox had continued, so in '63, Marshall and his team designed an amp based on the Fender Tweed Bassman and released the JTM 45. The earliest Marshalls were built with whatever parts the guys in the shop could pull together. They literally were selling one amp each week to have the money to buy the parts to build the next amp next week. But by 1965, they'd grown into more of a streamlined business, and it was that year that they released the first Plexi heads that would become their legacy, so named for the gold plexiglass front panel. The 100-watt Super Lead, along with its 50-watt sibling, became the iconic Marshall sound. By '69, the Plexi panels were replaced by aluminum, so those first 5 years defined the sound of rock music for that era. There are a number of factors that influence the sound of a Marshall versus a Fender or a Vox. By late '66, Plexis had moved to using a solid-state rectifier instead of a rectifier tube, as we'd seen in the Vox and the Fender. This gives them a faster and tighter response with less sag or voltage drop when you hit a big chord. This provided more power, a stiffer low end, with a punchier sound, perfect for high-volume rock and lead playing. Here again, the position of the tone stack impacts how much it can change the tone. In the Marshall, there are 2 gain stages before a cathode follower tone stack. This is a low impedance stage, and it's one of the reasons the tone stack on a Marshall doesn't change the tone as much as it does on a Fender. But this also means that there is less than half the signal loss running to the signal through the tone stack compared to that of a Fender, as it's the last thing before it runs into the phase inverter. Based on the '58 Fender Bassman, there is a lot less negative feedback than the later black panel Fender amps, leaving more mids on tap from the get-go. The values in the tone stack also lean more towards mid-range and highs, not generating as much deep bass and deep mids as the Fender. The important mid-range dip comes into play here as well, hitting at around 600 Hz with typical settings. Like the cut control on a Vox, the presence control on a Marshall lets you temper the tone. Turning it up will defeat some of the negative feedback, allowing for a more raw and present treble. The EL34 power tubes used had much more of a rock crunch and a creamier breakup than the 6V6 and 6L6 power tubes used in the Fenders. Starting with Alnico speakers in the early JTM 45s, they quickly moved to using ceramic speakers by '65 with the classic Celestion greenback. The ceramic speakers were more aggressive sounding than their Alnico cousins. With each speaker rated for 25 watts, Marshall needed to go to a 4x12 cabinet to handle the wattage produced by the 50 and 100 watt amps. The choice to make these closeback 4x12 Marshall cabinets again contributed to the tighter bass response. These were not country amps in any way. Well, at least until recently, that is. Late 60s and 70s up to the present day, users of Marshalls are a who's who of rock guitar history. Jimmy Page, Eric Clapton, the Allman Brothers, Steve Hackett, Jimi Hendrix, Pete Townsend, Billy Gibbons and Dusty Hill, Slash, Jeff Beck, Eddie Van Halen, Malmsteen, Angus, and Malcolm Young. The list is endless. All of these artists help cement the sound of Marshall in our minds as the sound of rock. Though I've sprinkled the tones throughout the video, I realized that I needed to put them next to each other so you can best hear the differences. So let's spend 30 seconds with David Barber, a Telecaster, a Les Paul, and the tones of the Fender, Vox, and Marshall. I've wanted to make this video for a long time. I just didn't think anyone had done one with just enough info about the history of the companies combined with how the amps are put together to explain why they sound the way they do. This was finally possible because I have friends like David Barber to help sort out the circuit from the sound. If I've left out your favorite Fender, Vox, or Marshall artist, put it in the comments for everyone to enjoy. I know from experience I can count on you. If you like this video, you'd probably enjoy my short history videos for the Deluxe Reverb, Vox AC30, and Marshall JTM45. First, I need to thank John Cordy for playing us into and out of the video, masterfully as always. I need to thank Lau Caldwell from Psionic Audio, Rhett Shull, and Emerald City Guitars for the use of the short video clips. And most of all, I need to thank David Barber for writing, recording, and producing the playing clips here, without which the differences in these amps wouldn't have been clear. I want to thank everyone that stopped by the new online store and grabbed some merch or a 5-Watt World Barber Electronics Collaboration overdrive pedal. You keep the channel going. And in particular, I need to thank my friends at 5-Watt on Patreon. It's the guitar community I've always wanted. You're all 5-Watt World. I just make the videos. If you like this style of video, be sure to subscribe and hit the like button on your way out. Thanks for hanging with me until the end. Until next time, I'm Keith Williams. Thanks for being a part of the 5-Watt World.